behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you to our new digital series, JLF Brave New World. Those of you who've missed our earlier episodes may watch them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, JPR Litfest. To tell you more about the fabulous speakers we have lined up for you in the coming weeks, please welcome Festival Directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple.
Dear friends of literature, friends of JLF, we are delighted at the response from all of you to our first digital session some days ago. And we return again today with more programming which looks at the world around us, the brave new world we are trying to understand and to access. Do tune in, do link in, do engage, do comment as we celebrate books, dialogues, and literature.
Hello, my name is William Dalrymple. I'm one of the co-directors of the Jaipur Literature Festival, and I'm here to encourage you to turn on for Brave New World. This is the Jaipur in Exile online digital festival. We have an extraordinary array of writers. There are not many positive things coming out of this terrible pandemic, but one positive thing is that all the writers we've ever wanted at Jaipur, who for one reason or another weren't able to make it so far, have all said yes. And we have writers such as Robert Macfarlane, Peter Carey, Alain de Botton, Emma Duval, writers we have longed to bring to you before, who've been too busy or unable to make the journey, who are now going to make it digitally online to a screen near you. So lock down, log in, and join us, please, for Brave New World.
Given the state of the world, where over 3.5 billion people are under lockdown, today's episode is vital in understanding the current global health crisis. Corona Chronicles, the past, present, and future of pandemics, with Siddhartha Mukherjee considered to be amongst the greatest medical minds, talks to Oxford historian Peter Frankopan, who predicted the outbreak of a major pandemic 6 months before it happened. Siddhartha Mukherjee is the author of The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer, and winner of the 2011 Pulitzer Prize and the Laws of Medicine. He's the editor of Best Science Writing 2013. The Gene and Intimate History is his latest work. Structure that may define humans, governs our form, function, and fate. The future of the heart at Columbia University, cancer physicians. Welcome, Siddhartha. Great to have you with us at JLF's Brave New World.
Thank you for having me.
Peter Frankopan is Professor of Global History at Oxford University, where he's also the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Director of the Oxford Center for Byzantine Research. His books include The Silk Roads, The New Silk Roads, and The First Crusade. In 2019, he was named one of the world's 50 top thinkers by Prospect magazine. Welcome, Peter. Fabulous to have you on board, all the way from Oxford. Thank you all for joining us, our audiences. Please do share the sessions as they're aired on your social media handles. You can ask questions of both our speakers today by entering it on your comment section. At the end, we will post them to both speakers, and hopefully we'll have some time to be able to have that interaction. Meanwhile, do remember to follow our handles, JLF bandwidth issues, which we know is a real problem right now across the world. You can find us on our YouTube channel, JPR Litfest. Siddhartha Mukherjee and Peter Frankopan, over to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure, Sid, to meet and talk. I wish we were on the front lawn in Jaipur, which is my favorite literary festival in the world. But we'll save that hopefully for next time if the viewers demand that we come. I hopefully find a way in the future. But tell me, Sid, because you have this extraordinary range, both of looking at pandemics from a point of view of a doctor, but also as a historian of disease. Tell us your finger in the air of where you think we are globally. What is going on with COVID-19 right now? How do you see this as a medical practitioner in terms of likelihood of vaccinations and so on? And then it'd be great to talk about pandemics more broadly. But how do you see the world today, on the 11th of April, 2020, with half the world's population locked down?
Well, obviously, first of all, thank you, Peter. I'm a big fan of your work, and thank you for being with me on this session. You know, I'm in New York City. We are at one of the epicenters of the pandemic. If you open the window, the streets are empty. They're windblown. There's the only sound you can hear is of ambulances rushing up and down, bringing people to the hospital. You had predicted, and others had predicted, that there would be a pandemic like this, but the experience of it is very surreal. The experience of it from Wuhan, from Italy, and from Spain were all surreal, but seeing it firsthand in New York City is extraordinary, and it's extraordinarily surreal. Where shall one begin? We might begin by saying that, you know, we live in a very different world than we lived in a century ago. Global travel is part of our world. Global economies are part of were part of our bread and butter. Economic life sustains human creative life. And we made deeper and deeper dives into a world where travel and movement was just assumed as part of human life. The first case in the United States was reported in January. It was a 35-year-old man who came back from visiting his relatives or friends in Wuhan and went to a small clinic in Washington State and presented with a dry cough. We, as a country, knew that this was coming. I would say, I've spoken many times about it, we were desperately unprepared. We were caught by surprise, although we should not have been caught by surprise. We are now doing a lot of genetic analysis on the virus and learning that, in fact, the virus had probably begun to circulate in New York City even by the early part of February. So for the United States, we were about a month behind the ball. And then there were several failings, including the failings of screening and finding the virus. If you take a very global picture of this, if you pan back from all the details, it's a reminder that we created a global world worried about bioterrorism, but didn't worry enough about biology itself. And in doing so, put ourselves up for a kind of peril which was not avoidable, but was much more containable than the one we have. And we can talk. I know a lot about the drugs and the vaccines, so we can talk more about those.
There's be so many different things that I'd like to talk about. So, you know, but why is it that coronaviruses are so dangerous? What is it that makes that is different to influenza viruses? What is it about this particular variant of a SARS, of COVID-19, of a SARS-2? Why is this one? I mean, I understand that we're connected. I understand it could have been contained better, dealt with at source in China and so on. And that's, from a historian's point of view, very interesting. But just from the medical perspective, what makes COVID-19 and other coronaviruses unusual, difficult to treat? Are we medically unprepared for them anyway? How come they manage to propagate so effectively?
Well, so there are several features of this particular virus, but let's talk about coronaviruses in general. Coronaviruses are a large family of viruses. They are RNA viruses. There are two features of this virus, 2 or 3 features of this virus that make it particularly dangerous. The first one, which is now still being measured, is something called the R naught or the R0 of this virus, and that is a measure of how many people you can infect if you have the virus yourself. So usually viruses that don't spread rapidly have R0s under 1, below the number 1. That means when you get the virus, you can infect one more person, but usually less than that. This virus, if you don't do any containment, has an R0 of around 2 to 3, which means that it puts it in an exponential form, which of course people don't fully grasp, but exponents are extraordinary. 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 16, 16 becomes and so forth. So we're dealing with a virus that has an extraordinary exponential capacity to grow.
Why is that? But just before you tell me, why is that? Why is it able to hook onto the receptor cells? How come it's so successful?
So the quick answer is that we don't know. It probably has to do with the amount of virus that is spread through respiratory droplets. So the so-called viral load in respiratory droplets of people who are sick is quite large. Okay. And secondly, we have a lot of receptors for the virus. We know the receptor that the virus latches onto. It's called ACE2. It's very common. It's present across the entire respiratory epithelium, also in our guts, in the intestines, and other places. So we don't exactly know why, but both viral factors and host factors make this virus very spreadable. It's the good news is that it's not a long-lasting virus, in the sense that it doesn't sit around for a long time. You can it's quite fragile. Actually, you can heat it up, you can bake it off using an oven. That's how we're using to decontaminate equipment. It's very sensitive to soap and Lysol and all these other kinds of things. So that's one part of the problem. The second part of the problem, the second part of the equation, is that aside from its R0 being very high, it also has a bigger problem, and that is that it has asymptomatic carriers. Now, that's a huge problem because unlike SARS, so remember SARS-CoV-2 is a cousin of SARS. Unlike SARS, where if you got SARS, you got sick, as for the most part. Unlike SARS, SARS-CoV-2 behaves very unusually in the sense that some people have the virus and can and transmit it, but be totally asymptomatic. And in fact, we think now that most of the viral transmission that's going on in places is from these asymptomatic carriers. And then once in a while, for reasons that we completely don't understand, but again has to do with viral factors and with host factors, you can get tremendously sick from it. We can talk about the sickness in a second, what that sickness exactly is and the range of that sickness, because there's new data from yesterday that is very, very fascinating. But just to give you one example, I have a very close colleague who's an oncologist. She and her husband, who's a cardiologist, both of them got COVID-19. He fell critically ill, and both tested positive, and she was completely asymptomatic, living in the same household, in the same family, obviously, likely exchange of respiratory droplets between them, but one was critically ill and one was not. So that's the second feature. The third one, and then I'll...
Sorry. Yeah. No, I just because I read your piece in the New Yorker and I just now about viral loads, which seems to be critical. And I know that you say how little we know about viral loads, but I mean that also leads into the idea that that these pandemics they don't come around like clockwork, but they are relatively predictable insofar as we've just forgotten as a world how to cope when these kinds of things happen. But tell me a little bit about the viral load side of things. It's an extraordinary case that you can have a couple living together, eating together, sharing the same bed, etc., and one person, heads towards the ICU unit, and the other one is totally fine. What is the biological explanation for those of us who don't remember their biology from school?
The quick answer is that we don't know. We suspect that that for most respiratory viruses, the amount of virus that you get, so in other words, you can imagine the body as a battlefield, and as an equilibrium. The immune system tries to attack and dampen the virus. The virus tries to attack and kill cells and replicate itself. So for most respiratory viruses, including influenza, and in fact SARS, the amount of virus that you get likely determines part of the outcome of the battle. In other words, if you get a lot of virus, you overwhelm the immune system and you can establish a serious infection. And so I don't know, I'm speculating, but in this particular case, one of the couple is a cardiologist, someone who was in the wards a lot, seeing a lot of patients with COVID. I will come back to that in a second. The other one is an oncologist, where in fact the amount of exposure to initial exposure to COVID was likely very, very little. But that's just speculation. Once the virus has established itself in your body, there's another viral load, which is how much virus you're actually replicating inside your body. And that's also proving to be critical. We now know that patients who are likely to get very sick, at least from small studies, secrete or have a lot of virus in their bodies, again, reflecting this dynamic equilibrium between the body and the virus. And those patients are likely to do worse. The new bits of news as of last night, I mean, I wake up in the morning and I start scanning because news starts coming in from Europe and other places. The two new bits of news is one thing that we didn't know is that the virus is, that in patients who are ill, the virus seems to be causing a lot of blood clotting, small blood clots in various places. A friend of mine who was infected sent me a picture of black and blue splotches on his skin. And in autopsies, we've seen that the lungs get lots of these we call them thrombi. So that's something very unusual. It's generally not the case with viruses that you get so many thrombi. And one speculation that we're sort of toying around with and thinking very hard about is maybe that's why people sort of decompensate so quickly. So in other words, you're sort of going along, fighting the virus, having your fevers, and the other consequences of the infection. And then a spray of blood clots comes, and that spray of blood clots either to the brain or to the arteries in the lung or the veins, etc., may be responsible. It's still too early to tell. This is just from autopsy series. So that's one feature that's one piece of news that's just fresh off the press. 3-4 articles on it this morning. And the question it raises is whether in the early stages of infection, whether one should use an anticoagulant, something to thin the blood, a blood thinner, like heparin or something. I have to say that in the past, when things like this have happened, using these blood thinners turns out to be counteractive. There have been cases in which you use a blood thinner while you think that there's a blood clot, and in fact, it increases your bleeding risk and you die from bleeding. So it's a very complicated question trying to figure out whether this is actually actionable or not. We have many, many blood thinners available in the pharmacopoeia. The second feature that just is, again, hot off the press from last night is an uncontrolled, which means that there was no control arm, but a study of a new drug which has been around and talked about quite a lot called remdesivir, a study of about 30-odd patients.
That's a malarial drug, is that right?
No, that is not the malarial drug. This is a drug, this is a true antiviral. So this was an antiviral that was initially created for Ebola virus, and that has been repurposed because we know that it binds to the enzyme that the virus uses to make copies of itself. So this was an uncontrolled observational study on 30 patients, 30 or 40 patients. But the good news is that it seems that there may be activity, but as you know, with these uncontrolled studies, it's extraordinarily hard to know whether these work or not. And there's a whole history in medicine of studies like this where, you have a glimmer of hope, but when you do a randomized controlled study, the drug doesn't work.
How do you see it? I mean, at the moment, my observation is that governments are finding it extremely hard to cooperate with each other. We have that as a real problem in Europe about whether members of the European Union are willing to provide support, financial as well as medical and so on. And, you know, there's an argument I've read overnight also saying that if in Europe we had shut down in the same way that Hubei province was shut down and pushed all medical staff onto Italy, when that happened, maybe we could have contained things better if we'd reacted in a different way. But the place where there is an enormous amount of high-level cooperation is between academic researchers into this area. But how hard is it to coordinate that kind of lab-based laboratory research? I mean, I hear from my colleagues in Oxford how well they're doing that, and I know there's a lot of willingness to share research and share updates. But how does that community work in practice, from your perspective as someone who participates in research too? So you know, there are two kinds of research, and they have to be, of course, crisscrossed with each other. One is basic research on the virus itself, finding new drugs and vaccines for the virus, and then there's clinical research. I think both factions, as it were, have mobilized extraordinarily fast. The genome of the virus was sequenced within weeks, and we're using various techniques, genetic techniques, to track the movement of the pandemic. I think the clinical research has, and it always does, the clinical research depends on some of this basic research, and it lags a bit. When things are ideal, like with the HIV pandemic, the clinical researchers and the basic researchers become one. They become part of the same story. They listen to each other and they learn from each other and they crisscross with each other. And if you look at the history of HIV, that was an inflection point in HIV research, because, in fact, even today, there are no real animal models of HIV. There are some sort of monkey models of HIV, but what people really started doing is using the tools that they had in the laboratory and understanding human HIV using those tools. And for HIV, that was a very important inflection point. That is where we, in fact, defined the role of viral loads. We began to use these as surrogates for clinical trials, and find new medicines and push them quickly into clinical trials by the cooperation of the clinical researchers and the basic scientists. That is now beginning to happen, I think, with COVID-19, and that's the richest that we can offer against the virus. And is that your expectation, that the way out of this will be some kind of vaccine-based solution that's mass-produced, rather than a pathway out of isolation where there's some other kind of reason why asymptomatics are much higher than we think they are, or that the viral load is different, or it changes climatically, or whatever it might be? Do you think that there is that the way out comes through medical intervention or vaccine intervention?
So I expect, and maybe I'll pose this question back to you, given the history of other pandemics. I expect that what's going to happen is that it's going to come in phases. Right now, we have really no drugs against the virus, aside from supportive care. The hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine are very poor. The evidence is very poor. This new drug, remdesivir, really maybe seems to work. We'll know in the next few days. The first phase of any drug coming out against the virus, or any activity against the virus, is going to be isolation, quarantine, and then supportive care. We have nothing else. And I think I would suggest that we maintain this phase until we begin to find things. The second phase is going to be using drugs that have already been tested in humans, and have some activity, the so-called repurposed drugs. So these are known to be safe in humans, but are repurposed to be able to be given to humans. And remdesivir is an example of that. It's already been used in humans in the case of Ebola, and was repurposed for its use in SARS-CoV-2. We'll know in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, as there's more data comes out, whether it's actually active against SARS-CoV-2 or not. But that the paper that came out last night is, I would say, encouraging. It doesn't solve the problem, but is encouraging. The third kind of drug that comes out against the virus is going to be man-made antibodies. We know that these are likely to work because if you take a person who's got the infection and has recovered from the infection, if you take their antibodies and you transfer them to a person who's acutely ill, in a small study in JAMA, it showed that those patients would recover. So there is a possibility. So there's a race to make these antibodies around the world. There are many people who are trying to make them. Actually, I am in conversation with the Gates Foundation to try to make these antibodies in India in collaboration with Biocon, with Kiran Shaw at Biocon. And we're actually having another conversation tomorrow. We're working overnight to get these going. These take time to make. These are not as quick as making a drug, like an aspirin or a Tylenol, which or repurposing a human drug.
But it's a similar story to what you've written about smallpox, about how you used to in the past seek to make small infections to build up resistance inside the body. So effectively taking some form of previous defense that's worked for somebody else and to replicate it to provide high levels of immunity. That's right. Just to clarify, that was a very dangerous practice, and we that had a mortality rate of 1%. You might get smallpox itself. So we've been telling people, don't try to do this at home. This is not a joke. So wait for the antibodies. We will try to make antibodies. Now, the question of whether the antibodies can be used, usually antibodies last about a month. So you really can't imagine prophylaxing the entire world of 6 billion people with antibodies that last for a month after month. So it's a big Band-Aid, but it's a Band-Aid. So how we'll use those antibodies is a big question. We're all working very, very hard on trying to figure out how to use these antibodies and how to bring them to India and other places to the developing world through many things, including Gavi and the Gates Foundation, and through, in my case, a collaboration with Biocon. Now we come to vaccines. Vaccines are the answer. This is a disease that I think is likely to be able to be vaccinated against. Unlike HIV, it doesn't seem to cause a chronic disease, although I was worried about these one recent report from South Korea that virus may be reactivating, but I think that's probably a retesting error, I hope. It's a retesting error. But that said, vaccines take about 12 to 18 months to make usually. And remember, with a vaccine, the question of safety is completely different. You're talking about giving it to completely healthy people. So you need to be really, really sure that the vaccine, much like you talked about with smallpox, you need to be really, really sure that you don't cause a disease when you make a vaccine. So the stakes are very different for a vaccine. And so I think, we'll just have to wait. The first vaccines are already entering phase 1 trials in the United States and across the world. So there's a race towards a vaccine as well, but that race is the slowest because of all the reasons that we talked about. Maybe I'll ask you, what do you think about sort of what are the steps in a pandemic like this that will get us out of our homes and restore economic activity, viable activity in either in the United States or in India? That I don't know, and I think that's not in my my toolkit of any expertise, because I think this is the medical side has to lead on this. I think what from the historian's perspective is that pandemics are regular occurrences. The jump from the animal chain through climatic, through bacteriological, there are a whole series of circumstances that produce these kind of freak events relatively regularly. And however awful this is, it's not as bad as the Black Death when a third of the population of Europe died. But the key thing is how non-specialists and how politicians make decisions through this process. So if I understood right from reading the Washington Post last week, when the chief medical officer eventually got hold of the president in the US, that Trump wanted to talk about vaping and when flavored vaping would be brought back in, rather than understanding the gravity of all of this process. So, it's true there could have been different steps taken across the world from China initially, but then going forwards. But we are where we are. The challenge will be, from my perspective, what happens to